Our next speaker is Dr. Christina Elson. The title of her presentation is Human-Centered Enterprise. Christina is the Managing Director of the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Market at the Robert Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. She has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Michigan Ann Arbor and is a graduate of the Executive MBA program at the Smith School of Business. Her professional career has focused on building and managing teams to create realistic strategies to successfully launch new ventures. Christina joined the Ed Snyder Center soon after its establishment in 2014 to create its strategy, direct its operation, and manage its growth. She has worked previously at the Museum of Natural History in New York, where she managed grant-funded research and education initiatives focused on Latin America. She also has worked for the National Geographic Society, where she focused on developing, tracking, and executing international research partnership. In 2010, she co-founded Science Visualization, a media company that works with national and international clients to create high-quality, integrated print media, graphics, animation, video, and exhibitions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christina.
Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the leadership of King Fahd University for the invitation to speak today. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be with you. And I'd like to send you all greetings from my home state of Maryland at the University of Maryland. Thank you very much for this opportunity. So I'm going to talk to you today about a concept that I call human-centered enterprise. So I'm really focusing on what we can do to help create students that will then go out into the world and be these innovative entrepreneurial people in the next generation that can commercialize these technologies and help create value for our society. I think that human-centered enterprise is a good model for teaching students things like integrity and honesty. And also a desire to find solutions to problems not just in business but also in society. I'm going to apply this model to a debate about energy policy that's happening in my home state of Maryland, just to give you an example. But before I get started with that, I'd like to just tell you a very little bit about myself. So who am I? I'm not a typical business person. As you heard before I went into business, I worked for many years in international research in anthropology. I earned a PhD from University of Michigan. My husband and I started a communication business, and I realized that I needed to shore up my own business skills. So I went to the University of Maryland's Executive MBA program. While I was there, I was invited by Dr. Rajri Agarwal to start this new Center for Enterprise, Entrepreneurship, and Markets. The center was founded by Ed Snyder, who is a phenomenal business person. He built a conglomerate of companies in sports and entertainment, and he also started the Philadelphia Flyers hockey franchise in Philadelphia. We also received funding from the Charles Koch Foundation. Charles Koch is a well-known entrepreneur in the United States. So as an anthropologist, I am interested in how humans organize into groups and why groups, organizations, and firms can flourish or fail. History has shown that when we do create the right environments, we can unleash human energy and we can foster a lot of potential in our society and create broadly shared prosperity. This is an example of the Ford Motor Company. This company not only revolutionized production and transportation, but it also revolutionized the way that people think about the way they work by instituting an 8-hour workday and also a guaranteed wage for its workers. For a long time, innovation has driven the American economy, but since the Great Recession in 2008, business formation in the U.S. has been overall weak. And if you look at these graphs by the Economic Innovation Group, they show you that the opening of small businesses and corporations has barely been able to exceed their closure. And this is something that in past decades, even through economic upturns and down cycles, really hadn't happened. So this is concerning, the cycle of innovation and creative disruption that is sort of at the core of the Western capitalist business system. Has recently been called even into question by The Economist magazine, suggesting that we need to rethink several of these systemic tenets that have been tightly grasped about the system of innovation and entrepreneurship. So some of these are first that this cycle of competition and creative disruption is working, right? Another one is that we live in an entrepreneurial age. Another one is that technology is going to continue to drive faster business growth. And another one is that globalization is inevitable. So whether you subscribe to this point of view or not, what a lot of these indicators are saying to many people is that this is a good time to critically reassess some of the ideas that have gone unquestioned for decades about the way that we think about enterprise and entrepreneurship. And that some of these things, by looking more differently at some of these ideas, we want to think about how our own biases and assumptions may be influencing some of this. So some of the reasons that we need to do this are because, as you can see in this photograph showing one of these recent marches in Washington, D.C., where people went to air a very wide range of grievances about different kinds of cultural and economic issues. It's becoming increasingly hard in many societies to reach agreements about how things should work in business and society. And I believe that business schools especially can be leaders in helping address not just economic and social impasse, but we need to do this by questioning some of our long-held assumptions and welcome also the integration of information from multiple disciplines. We also need to recognize the powerful influence that culture and society plays. So before I talk about how we can think about solving some of these problems, I want to talk a little bit to you about where I think some of these problems are coming from. And in order to do this, we're going to look at several disciplines. So we're going to look at anthropology, we're going to look a little bit at history and psychology, and then we're going to look at that case study about energy policy that I talked about in Maryland. So anthropologists have documented that all societies have to find ways to balance supporting the goals and aspirations of individuals with supporting the goals and aspirations of a group. So who am I is very important, but then also how is who am I defined by who all of we are. Now this statement by Dr. Margaret Mead said, I personally measure success in terms of the contributions that an individual makes to her or his fellow human beings. And that really reflects the fact that all of us feel that we can make valuable contributions to society. Now over millennia, and especially as states and empires and social and political classes emerged, societies developed very different approaches to fostering group unity, trust, and cultural cohesion. Now, these are basically codified standards about how things should work in any given society. And just to show you here, of course, while Egyptians and the Maya both thought that building pyramids was a really important thing for them culturally, these buildings have very different functions in their respective cultures. So cultural consensus is something that fosters unity, and this can work even in places where there is a great deal of diversity, such as in America. You know, America's founding is attributed to rugged colonists who, threw off an English monarchy because it didn't recognize their rights as individuals, but America's founding fathers adopted as their national motto, E pluribus unum, which means out of many one. And in 240 years since our country's independence, and despite many ups and downs, Americans have managed to create a broadly shared culture that they do see as distinct from other cultures in the world. But it is increasingly hard for Americans who do share a broad cultural common perspective to agree about how things should work in business and society. And to understand a little bit about why that is, we want to look a little bit more about human nature. So according to Jonathan Haidt, whose work has originated a descriptive theory called moral foundations theory, there's a good quote from him. He says that human nature is not just intrinsically moral, it's also intrinsically moralistic, critical, and judgmental. So let's talk a little bit about what he means by this. And we'll start with the first part of the quote, that human nature is intrinsically moral. Moral foundations theory proposes that the adaptive pressures of our long evolutionary history created a human mind that is actually prepared in advance to learn values, norms, and behaviors in advance of experiencing them. We learn to do this in response to a diverse set of reoccurring social problems. So we're going to look a little bit about what that means. And one thing it means is that humans are born with a first draft of a moral person. But humans are also highly, highly adaptable. And as you can see, we live everywhere. We're the only species that actually does this. And being adaptable to our environments and to our cultures is one reason that humans thrive. Second, moral foundations theory proposes that there are actually primordial values, norms, and behaviors that we were predisposed to learn, and we needed to do this to solve these tricky reoccurring social problems. And in this simplified graph, I've actually shown you some of the adaptive challenges we wanted to address and some of the traits that we see as actually virtuous in modern humans. And I just want to take you through these step by step so we can look at them. The first one is that humans invest many, many years in nurturing and protecting our helpless children, and we value this trait of caring and kindness in other people. Second, going back to this interplay between individuals and groups, egalitarian groups studied by anthropologists actually have created quite sophisticated mechanisms to keep things egalitarian. And so they do that by encouraging individual effort, which is actually discouraging laziness, and also encouraging group sharing, which would be discouraging things like bullying and tyrants. So we, as humans, we value people who are self-reliant, and we also value mechanisms that help keep things like bullying and tyrants in check. Third, we learned very early in our evolutionary history that cooperating with one another got us much further, much faster. And so we value people who are trustworthy, just, and fair when they're dealing with us. Besides just getting together as individuals to actually accomplish tasks, we also needed to form teams and coalitions that could help our group manage relationships with other groups. So we value people who are loyal and patriotic to their group, and we also value people who are willing to sacrifice for the well-being of a group. Fifth, humans create many kinds of hierarchical relationships. At the most elementary level, these are based on things like age and family and experience. This is actually a very good thing. It's highly beneficial for group integration and unity, and we value people that are obedient and deference that show these traits, especially for things like age and experience. Finally, when humans learn to interact with the natural world, they recognize that certain behaviors as groups help them avoid things like communicable diseases. And today, these virtues can be understood as a deep respect for people who demonstrate things like temperance, piety, and cleanliness. So based on anthropological, biological, and psychological studies of many thousands of people over decades, moral foundations theory proposes that, at least for Americans, Americans can be roughly sorted into three main groups. And what's interesting is that these groups assign very different kinds of importance to those foundations that we just discussed. So for convenience, we're going to call these different groups progressive groups, conservative group, and libertarians, okay? And we're going to look at the value proposition for each one of these groups. For progressives, they put a great deal of weight on the Care and Harm Foundation, some on the Liberty Oppression Foundation, some on the Fairness and Cheating Foundation, and very little on the other three foundations. The overarching concern for people who assign themselves into this group is that they're very concerned with the oppression of individual freedoms. So they look at things from the worldview of, does what may be happening here hurt or oppress anyone? Now, conservatives place more equal weight on all six of these foundations. For them, the needs of individuals don't necessarily outweigh the needs of groups, and they care very much about things like customs and traditions that help support and shape their communities. Libertarians might be something of an American phenomenon. About the only thing they care about is this liberty and oppression formation. A little bit about the fairness and cheating. These tend to be highly rational and individualistic people who believe that humans generally will freely and willingly engage in trade with one another, and they don't think it's the role of authorities to tell anyone how to live their life or conduct their business. So now let's look for a minute at the second part of this statement, which says that human nature is also intrinsically moralistic, critical, and judgmental. And let's discern a little bit about what this means. For one thing, it means that our brains are experts at forming rapid intuitive judgments. This is also something that humans have done for many millions of years. Becoming hardwired to do this well, along with being very adaptable people, are actually really the two reasons that humans have been so successful. Second, nature and nurture make sure that no two human brains are the same and no two human beings are the same. So while all of us may be hardwired to be more or less open to a new situation has the potential to be exciting and provide discovery, or also to be fearful and worrisome. Our upbringing and our education is what will reinforce or downplay many of our natural tendencies. Finally, we have much less experience with logical reasoning. This is something that came later with the evolution of language. Western cultures tend to think more individualistically and analytically than other cultures in the world that often tend to think more communally and more holistically. So to put it all together, the vast majority of Americans strive to be upstanding members of their communities and their organizations, but they don't always all care in the same way about these same values. And because intuition is so deeply ingrained, and intuition always happens with us before reasoning, we will often try to justify our intuitive choices after the fact with our ability to do very well strategic logical reasoning. So the question then becomes, how does this impact our thinking about innovation and entrepreneurship? And just importantly, why do we need to be aware of these concepts if we would like to be successful in business ourselves and also help other people learn to be successful? So I want to answer these questions by doing this case study about energy policy in Maryland. This will help us show a little bit about how these influence the way people approach these recognized problems that can impact business. And this is a statement by Charles Koch, which, honestly, it seems really hard to argue with this statement. Instead of stifling progress, we encourage Americans to embrace permissionless innovation, the idea that new technologies and business models should be allowed to develop unhindered if they pose no serious harm. I mean, who can argue with that? The problem, of course, is that words like progress, unhindered, and harm are going to mean very different things to very different people. So let's talk for a minute about Western Maryland, where I live, and we're going to talk about hydraulic fracking out there. As you know, around 2008, a big boom began in the U.S. As these technological advancements and deep horizontal drilling combined with hydraulic fracturing techniques made it profitable to begin to tap these formations, such as the Marcellus Shale Formation. That's up there in the northeastern part of the U.S., that sort of big brown area. This map shows some more detailed features of that formation. It stretches from New York here down to the sort of southern part of Virginia. And it shows its location in Maryland, and in red it shows this part of the western part of Maryland where fracking might take place. Now, this formation also overlaps with an area that culturally is distinct. It's called the Appalachia region. This is a predominantly rural and mountainous area. It has a culture that was created in the 1800s as immigrants from England, Ireland, and Scotland came to the U.S. It has always relied on industries like farming, coal mining, and manufacturing. Those jobs have declined and disappeared in the U.S. over the decades, and these areas have gone into an economic decline, which they still suffer from. This is just an example to show you that in many cases, these small factories and jobs in Appalachia just disappeared overnight. So in 1957, the small silk factory was just abandoned one day, and it actually still contains everything there that was left by the workers and the owners when they walked out. This area of the country lags behind the rest of the state in education and income. Only about 18% of people here have college degrees, compared with about 38% as the state for a whole. And the median income is much lower, about $30,000, than is the state for a whole. It also is, as you can see from these voting patterns, it's more culturally conservative. It tends to vote Republican, while the rest of the state in blue around Baltimore and Washington, D.C., usually votes very solidly Democratic. But let's look now at some facts about the business of fracking. And as we're doing this, what I'd like you to do in your mind is weigh the pros and cons of doing this in Western Maryland, and also how you think that these groups that we talked about before, the progressive and conservative groups, would actually approach this issue. So fracking has economic considerations, important economic considerations. It could possibly create over 1,800 jobs in this part of Maryland, generate significant revenue for this area. It could add over $300 million in value to the local economy. It could create over 7,000 jobs just in the pipeline industry alone, and something like $350 million in wages every year for the next 10 years. There are health and environmental considerations that fracking purportedly brings to these areas when it happens. Many studies show that there are greater tendencies for people who live around wells to suffer from problems like sinus problems, headache problems, and other issues. Fracking has really helped reduce CO2 emissions, particularly in Maryland. Between 2006 and 2014, it reduced CO2 emissions in Maryland by 39%. Tourism also could be impacted by fracking. A good percentage of the local population works in leisure and hospitality, and this does generate revenue for the state in terms of sales taxes, and these are funds that go into the local economy to support things like schools and roads and things like that. So the fracking a 2-year moratorium on fracking has ended in October, and right now in Maryland, this is being heavily discussed about whether or not this should be allowed in the rest of the state. So on the one hand, here's a quote from the pro-fracking side of the issue. They say that the fracking revolution has made fuel very affordable. Substituting gas for coal reduces carbon and it reduces other pollution. The governor and legislator should be working together to finalize fracking rules and not just indulge in anti-fracking absolutism. Now, the other side says that fracking advocates have failed to make the case that the economic benefits for doing this are going to outweigh the potential economic and other environmental and health concerns. So the question really is, for progressives and conservatives, do the benefits, each of these groups weighing, do the benefits from fracking outweigh the concerns? So on the one side, if we think about the progressives and we think about the conservatives, let's sort of take a look at these. Who would think that this ad would represent more likely the progressive side or the conservative side of the issue? Would anybody say progressives? Who would think it's the progressives? I have one person that's saying progressive, 2 or 3 people. Okay, I see in the back, yes. Yes, this image sums up very clearly how people with the progressive mindset would approach this view. And what you can see here very clearly are these 2 key drivers, which are the care harm and the liberty oppression. So for this group, the potential harm from this environmental economic policy is too great, and they feel that there are many people who are either too weak or uninformed to fight oppression that could occur, or the harm that could occur to them. Now, these images sum up more the conservative point of view. You can see that there are a lot more drivers at work here. For conservative, it's all about weighing whether the economic and social benefits support things like self-reliance, traditions, and the valued institutions. Maryland's governor has said that he will support fracking in Western Maryland, and of course the representatives in Western Maryland also support this policy. But the legislative branch of the state of Maryland is controlled by all the progressives that live in the central part of the state. So this is where this debate and discussion now comes in. There are ways to navigate through these kinds of impasses, but it takes stepping back and taking time to address a very real diversity of perspectives. And, in a sense, none of these can be considered wrong. These are just different people who have different ways of looking at this issue. So what can we do to help people engage in productive conversations that actually foster innovation and enterprise? Henry Ford knew that to be a very successful business person, you had to have empathy. And his quote is that, if there's any one secret of success, it lies in the ability to get into the other person's point of view and see things from their side as well as from your own. We can't teach people to do this if we only teach abstract economic, business, and political theories. This is what's really important here. We can't really turn men and women into this economist fantasy of a person called Homo economicus who only sees things from an extremely rational point of view. And has an infinite ability to make rational decisions. Clearly we want to focus on teaching things like logic and critical thinking, but for solving problems and for creating conditions that are necessary to support enterprise and innovation, we also need to understand things like intuition and morality and how deeply seated these are in our biology, behaviors, and cultures. So the moral foundations theory I discussed is just one example of how we can do that. When we embrace a diversity of thought and perspective, it allows us to be able to solve problems in ways that help create trust. And so I just want to tell you very briefly a few things that we're doing at the University of Maryland to foster innovation and to train this next generation of enterprising business people. Here's a view of the main part of the campus. We have curriculum programs that train students in business skills clearly. They also try to foster this human-centered enterprise perspective. We do this by using these tools like design thinking and systems thinking. We try to teach students to solve problems using empathy and also using teamwork. Let's see. We also try to take this interdisciplinary viewpoint in teaching. So we integrate information from many different disciplines, including things like philosophy, anthropology, engineering, computer sciences. We have programs that integrate students from computer science, engineering, and business into cross-functional teams that work on solving problems together. We also think about ways that we can break down traditional academic silos. This can be very difficult, but it is important. I'm just going to show you here a very small example of some of the things that Maryland does to break down these silos between research centers, the teaching schools, and then move these ideas out of the academic realm into these public-private partnership areas that can support the transfer and commercialization of different kinds of ideas, whether it's energy policy, energy research, or tech research, or whatever. So everything up here tries to find ways to work together, whether it's teaching students or in research as well. Thank you. So just to sum up, I believe that human-centered enterprise creates leaders who can deeply intuitively connect with one another. They create trust. They're better able to amplify one another's contributions and create broadly shared value for the entire society. It also helps us find ways through impasses, whether these are political or ways that we think about how business should work in society. I know this was the case. This is my executive MBA class, and I know that this was the case with the people I had the great fortune to work with there. So Ed Snyder, the founder of the research center where I am, once said that money is the reward and not the reason. And I think that the reason really is the feeling of accomplishment that comes from creating value for oneself and for one's society. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Thank you so much. You mentioned integration. I think it is so relevant to integrate many disciplines, as you mentioned. So one of my ideas is that religious guys, it's odd, but religious guys must have like an engineer, a marketing person. We need to integrate all of these disciplines so that we get in our society, we face such a problem. Like engineers are one sector of, there is differentiation. They are not integrated, so they have some sort of conflict among each other. This is one point I wanted to mention. Another one is that maybe to understand ourselves, we might use like Myers-Briggs system. You mentioned intuition, sensory. Sensory people might be some sort of conservatives usually, and intuitionists might be some sort of liberals. So we need to have, we need to appreciate such theories so that we can improve ourselves. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your comment. It's helpful to help people understand who they are and what their unique skills and capabilities are, because that helps them understand how they can work better with other people. And sometimes assessments can help with that, like the ones that you've mentioned. That's very true.
So I'm going to build on his question. So in the U.S., we have these progressive, maybe libertarian and conservative camps, but in any society, there's camps. What can we do when we're building the values for entrepreneurship to bridge these camps? How do we, instead of just having the camps talk to each other, bridge and find commonality so we can integrate the way he suggested? What do we do? What actions?
Yeah, I think the actions are really important. In the university level, programs that actually place students who do have different perspectives and are coming from different backgrounds, so the engineers, the computer sciences, the business students, putting them together and teaching them to work together to actually do projects, whether it's something that is creating a real business or just doing consulting or helping another company look at problem solving in a problem solving environment. I think that's really helpful, and I think that's where these tools like design thinking come in, and also doing that interculturally, so cross-culturally, working with other institutions is very helpful for that too.
Hi. Hello? Here.
Hi, hi, sorry.
I'm referring to the quote you gave earlier about how a quote-unquote permissionless environment is more conducive to innovation. My understanding is that how would you explain that both Kaiserine and Nazi Germany were far more innovative than the U.S. In technologically in most fields, despite not being this this supposedly permissionless society?
Right. Well, that's where, you have to think about the role of morality and culture. So we don't want to create societies where anything goes, right? No, that's not anyone's goal. We want to create societies where we can guide students within these agreed upon codified standards about how things should work, and really talk and have dialogues about that. But yeah, it's not about creating societies where anything goes. Does that answer your question?
Not really. I mean, I just it just
not
seems
quite
to me
sure
that
what
that,
you're
that,
asking,
that,
yeah.
that the state-sponsored
Uh-huh.
countries such as Kaiser and Nazi Germany for decades were far more innovative than the U.S. and France and other countries.
Yeah, I might take issue with that. I think the U.S. has been very innovative for many centuries. I do think that right now, because of some of the issues, economic issues and other kinds of impasses that we need to learn to work through better, things maybe have changed a little bit, but I don't think the U.S. has been less innovative than.
Thank you. One last question.
Thank you for the presentation. I just have one question. You spoke about teaching design thinking at your center. So do you have your own model of design thinking that you teach, or you employ a pre-existing model?
Right, so I think teaching things like design thinking and systems thinking is really about the prompts that you use and how you work with the students in a live and highly interactive setting. So it needs to be customized to the institution and environment that you, and the problems that you want to work through. So, the core elements of design thinking are really just teaching things like customer discovery and empathy and iterative processes. And I think the important part is really thinking about how to customize that to your particular problems that you want to solve, and doing that and with the students, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.